Hello, students. I wish I could be with you today, but unfortunately I'm giving a lecture in Australia this week. My name is Professor Vinsel. I'm a professor in the College of Arts and Letters, and I'm director of the Science and Technology Studies program. This class is known as HST 120, or the Introduction to Science and Technology Studies. But we're going to call it something different. We're going to call it Peoples and Things, an Introduction to Technology Studies. Now this title change is important. Among other things, it means that we're not going to be talking about science much, except for insofar as science impacts the way we create and use technologies. If you're primarily interested in science, like you're a scientist or you're just fascinated by science, you can take this course later with Professor Wellerstein or Professor McPhail. Professor Wellerstein focuses almost wholly on science, and Professor McPhail tries to offer a balance between the two topics. But in this semester, we will be concentrating on human life with things, especially those things that we call technologies. Today I'm going to explain how this course will work and outline the topics we'll cover. But before we do that, it might be helpful to think about what motivates this class, or what has motivated me to make this course, Peoples and Things. And the first thing that motivates me is that we live in a world full of hype. It's full of chatter about technology, which many people assume is important. Our society is both technophilic, or technology loving, or even has a fetish for technology, and it's equally technophobic, or technology fearing, and neither side of this kind of split is particularly insightful. On the technophilic side, perhaps some of you have friends or loved ones who regularly get stoned on Elon Musk. You can kind of see the vapors wafting from the crack under the door. Or perhaps you know some poor soul who thought that Bitcoin was going to revolutionize society and lead to the downfall of the Federal Reserve, instead of just letting the unethical individuals out there buy more Elon Musk off the dark web. Or maybe you have some sucker who thought that 3D printers were going to revolutionize our lives, and we were all going to have 3D printers in our house printing off various objects, anything our hearts desired. On the technophobic side, of course, there's your grandmother or grandfather or whoever who thinks that smartphones are going to lead to the downfall of our civilization. And we could list many other examples of how technology and people think our technologies are going to destroy us. So in other words, the first motivation is that we are surrounded by hype and nonsense about technology. Now, some of this nonsense is of a particular form that we call bullshit. Now, before you get upset and think that your professor is using profanity in the classroom, please know that this asterisk here means that I'm using purely the technical definition of bullshit, which comes from Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt's famous essay on bullshit from 1986, which was later published as a book. Frankfurt argues that when people BS, they are claiming that they have done some kind of work or that they have some kind of knowledge, when in reality they are just trying to impress people or push their own interests. A bit like a student who didn't do his or her reading but pretends to know what is going on in class for the sake of his or her grade. Frankfurt argues that BS is more immoral than lying, because at least liars are just wrong, whereas bullshit artists actually hammer us with waves of garbage that obscure the fundamental issues we are trying to understand. And that's where we are with technology. We are drowning in nonsense. Now, we'll be working all semester to identify hype and BS, but if you're just dying to learn what I'm talking about, you can go and buy this publication. Let's see if I have it here. Yes, this publication right here, it's called Wired Magazine. And it is published by an enormous cattle ranch in a state called California. And just giant bulls on this cattle ranch, giant bulls. You can smell it. You can smell it. So if this is our problem, that we're surrounded by nonsense, what's the solution? The answer is that unlike those people who don't try but pretend to try, we have to do real work. And here we can start to draw on kind of moral metaphors like rigor and discipline, to be disciplined or to be rigorous. This brings us to our second motivation for the class. In universities, or what we call academia, there are things called disciplines, including anthropology, economics, history, political science, psychology, sociology, and so on. And part of what defines disciplines, indeed what makes them disciplines, in the sense of training people to have rules and codes, is that they have methods, which are semi-organized ways of coming to know the world, or at least that's what we pretend they are, that we have some kind of organized ways to know things. For instance, psychologists tend to do lab experiments or stick people in giant magnets. Historians tend to hang out in archives and read dead people's mail, etc., etc. All the disciplines have things they do, and it is hoped at least that such work takes us beyond mere BS. Now, when it comes to technology, there's good news and bad news about the disciplines. The good news is that many of them had made enormous strides over the last 50 years in understanding human life with technology. The bad news is that the disciplines hardly ever talk to each other. Now, thank God, because most of you won't be going into academia, you won't have to think about this very much. But you can think of the disciplines as roving street gangs, and individual members of the disciplines mostly try to impress each other in their own gang, other people in their own gang, and they hardly ever talk to people in the other street gangs other than to holler some insult right before throwing a rotten egg. Now, for instance, historians like myself, I have a PhD in history, are trained to just loathe economists. To this day, when I encounter economists, I see them as kind of humanoid forms topped by what appear to be turkey heads. But then I have to force myself to remember, like, you are looking at a human being. You are looking at a human being. Now, of course, I'm joking, but the point here is that the way that universities work is that these different groups, many of which are studying technology and many of which have important things to say about technology, basically don't talk to each other. The result is that there are interesting ideas out there about human life with technology. And lots of it is supported by pretty fascinating research, but there's no central place we can go to learn about this. There's no book we can turn to. And this situation frustrates me, so what I decided to do was make this class. And it starts from the question, what do all the smart people out there with big fancy degrees think about the social dimensions of technology or human life with technology today? And how can we draw this knowledge together? What do we currently believe about the relationship between peoples and things? That's what this course is about. Now, every week, except for this one, we'll have the same basic structure in this course. On Wednesdays and Thursdays, I'll lecture, and then on Fridays, we'll discuss the readings for that week. Now, right now, I'm going to walk you through topics we're going to cover, and then I'll explain the course requirements and grading to you. This first week is simply an introduction to the course. The only thing which you probably will not like is instead of having discussion on Friday, as we've already discussed, you will be writing me a 3-page paper answering the question, what is technology? And that paper will be a reflection on the 2 readings we have for this week, the first by Eric Schatzberg and the second by Paul Nightingale. From there, next week we're going to introduce the 2 basic concepts that we'll be using in this course. And I will argue that we can get a lot of mileage out of understanding technology and human relationships with technology just through these 2 concepts alone. They'll provide the kind of foundation that we'll use to build forward. The first notion is the idea of affordances, or an affordance. And an affordance is just a possible course of action that we perceive in the world given the objects around us. Like, given that this is a magazine, I know that I can pick it up and that I can open it like this. It's in a book form. This form has a particular history. We learned how to make things like this a long time ago. There are words. I can use it to read some BS. So that's the affordances, and then the social networks are basically a rigorous or hopefully clear way of thinking about human relationships and social structures. Social networks can range from thinking qualitatively, like doing interviews, or going and observing people, or doing history and looking at their letters, to fairly mathematical, quantitative, formalized ways of thinking about social networks with diagrams and math and what have you. In this second lecture, where I'll explore social networks, we're going to think about both how humans' relationships with affordances are determined by their social networks. And to think about this, one thing we'll do is look at how ethnologists and psychologists have studied animal relationships to affordances. So we'll look at research on Israeli roof rats and how they learned how to use pine cones, and how chimpanzees take up termite fishing. From there, we're going to go to the next week on hierarchy, called Hierarchy and Segregation. And here we're going to think about how our relationships with technology are determined or influenced by basically social status and social hierarchies, including inequality. So in the first lecture, what I'm going to look at is an old argument going back to the 18th and 19th century, which says that the birth of agriculture, so one of the primary technological revolutions in human society, is what gave birth to inequality. We'll find that it's actually more complicated by that, but that there's some truth to the idea that technologies and how we produce surplus are tied to inequalities, how wealth and power are distributed in society. In the second lecture, we'll look at how hierarchies, social hierarchies like class and other forms of inequality, map onto segregation. And we'll look at 2 forms of segregation: segregation around work and segregation about where we live, so housing stock. We'll find that, for instance, what we call the gender division of labor, so how men and women have different skills in their body and do different things, is a kind of ancient form of work segregation that maps onto social hierarchies. We'll think about how race and segregated labor around race, and we'll think about that history that going back to at least to slavery in the United States. And then we'll think about the long, long, long history of segregated housing. So how some groups that are on the top of society live in some places, and the kind of lower classes live in other places. And we'll find that this history goes back many, many centuries. From there, we're going to go into a week on how new things diffuse into society, so how new things spread around, how we choose, both at the organizational and individual level, to adopt technologies, which includes at the individual level consumption, how we act as consumers, and how, for instance, psychologists think about consumer behavior, and finally, what we can get out of thinking about the way we use things. Why are we starting with this instead of starting with invention, which is where most classes on this topic start? And the answer is that whereas it might make sense to some people to start with invention, because invention is the beginning of a new technology, when it comes to our own lives, we're actually born into a society that already has all of these things around us. Most of the objects that surround you where you're sitting right now are not new. And they pre-exist you by, in some cases, centuries. But through the course of your life, especially through rearing, how you're being raised by your family, your parents, you've learned to use all of these things around you. So my argument is that when we're thinking about society and we're thinking about human life, it actually makes more sense to start with use. Then from there, we will move on to invention. And depending on how we define the word invention, we'll find that invention is either quite common or quite rare. It's common because, if you go into anyone's houses or meet their mother and father and watch how they do things, we all come up with little workarounds in our houses. For instance, maybe some door requires some, has some little fix on it that you have to know exactly how to do work with that fix to make the door work, or something like that. We all come up with little fixes in our lives, which can be thought of as small problem solving, or small instances of problem solving or invention. On the other hand, when we think of radically new things, the kinds of things we often celebrate when it comes to invention, like the light bulb. You can think of how whenever someone has an idea in a cartoon, a light bulb goes off next to them. Well, those kinds of inventions are actually quite rare, and inventors in this way are pretty weird when it comes down to it. So in the lectures for this week on invention, in the first lecture I will look at kind of the biological and psychological underpinnings of how we introduce new things in the world through problem solving. And here we'll also look at, for instance, again, how ethologists and psychologists have looked at problem solving amongst animals. And in the second lecture, I will look at how institutions and cultural aspects or parts of our culture have changed since, say, 1700 to encourage or foster more innovation. So we'll talk about things like intellectual property laws and patents, for instance, and just how we developed a culture or even a cult of invention through which we celebrate inventors. From there, we will go into a week on organizations. Now, modern technologies go hand in hand with bureaucratic organizations which both produce technologies and use them. Such bureaucratic organizations include companies, corporations, government, universities, what have you. In the first lecture, I will look at an argument that was perhaps first put forward by the historian Alfred Chandler, which said that what we think of as the modern corporation, which arose in the late 1800s, the late 19th century, really was about organizations blossoming around large-scale, capital-intensive technologies, like the railroad, or like petroleum production, or the automobile industry, or the chemical industry. All of these industries that involve really large-scale production. Now, it'll turn out that when it comes to business history, things are much more complicated like that, than that. So what we'll do is kind of trace forward this argument that organizations have kind of special relationships with technologies. In the second lecture that week, I'll offer kind of two brief exegeses. One is that I will look at the role of communications in organizational technologies in bureaucracies. And this will include a history that takes us from the filing cabinet and memos and paper clips and things like that to the kind of complex logistical and computer systems used by companies like Walmart and Amazon today. You can think of email, for example, although you guys no longer use email. The second thing I'll look at is to kind of hammer home the point that technologies are used by all forms of human organizing, not just large organizations like universities and corporations. We'll think about how social movements or social uprisings use technologies. We can go back, for instance, to the role the printing press played in the American Revolution. Or we can think about how social media played a role in the so-called Twitter revolutions or the Arab Spring. And to give one brief case, I'll describe how activists use the mimeograph machine, personal automobiles, and buildings called churches to undertake the Montgomery bus boycott. After that, we'll have a midterm week. The way that week will work is on Wednesday we'll do some review together, and I'll give you some example questions that you might face on the midterm. And then on Thursday and Friday, so two 50-minute sections, you will take the midterm, which will consist of a number of essay questions for you to answer in blue books. From there, we will go into a week on systems and infrastructure and maintenance. Now, most history of technology and technology studies in general before, say, the 1970s or 1980s focused on the invention of specific things like the light bulb or peanut butter or the telephone or any of these things. And what scholars found at around, say, 1980 is that this way of thinking about technology is not very helpful for thinking about all of the large-scale technological systems that surround us every day and that we depend on, such as the electric power grid or the internet or the complex roadways or sewer systems that we depend on. So much of this is what we describe as infrastructure. So in the first lecture, we will talk about how this kind of theory of systems developed, especially in the history of technology and other fields. And then in the second lecture, we will think about how systems are maintained. Because part of my working life has involved challenging the notion that we should be focused on innovation and thinking that actually most of our lives, including most of what you are going to do as engineers if you become engineers, is focused on simply keeping the systems that we already have going. We know that about 70 to 80% of the work of engineers simply goes into upkeep and maintenance. So if we want to have a realistic and grounded perspective on technological systems and technologies around us, we need to think about how maintenance works and what this looks like when it plays out. From there, we will go to a week on industries, professions, and standards. Now, increasingly, economists, economic historians, and other people have, how should I put this? Increasingly, they see the fate of technologies as tied to the fate of industries, which go through particular life cycles. They rise, they become mature, they decline, they disappear, etc. So in the first lecture, we will talk about how we think about industries and how their life cycles play out. And in the second lecture, I will talk about these kind of things, professions and standards that have gone along with the rise of modern organizations like corporations and modern government. So we can think about how professional societies grew, such as the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, for instance, or the Society of Automotive Engineers, and all these professional groups that exist in our society today. And it will turn out that many engineering groups spend a great deal of their time standardizing things, again, like light bulbs or screw threads or the internet or Wi-Fi. All of these things are standards that we depend on. So we'll think about how professions and standardization have played a role in modern society and in the birth of modern industries. From there, we'll go into a week on politics, policy, and regulation. Here we're specifically thinking about what we might think of as formal politics, like voting, political parties, and the various levels of government, state, local, federal, and the various branches of government, the judiciary, the legislative branch, and the executive branch, and how these parts of government relate to technology, how they control technology, how they spur on the growth of technology, etc. In the second lecture, I will focus particularly on the role of regulation, which formed the subject of my early work, and we'll think about how regulation shapes technological change. From there, we'll go into a week on accidents, disasters, and terrorism. There's a literature going back to the 1980s which says that when things go wrong, we actually learn a great deal about both our technological systems and our relationship to those things. For instance, how we are dependent on them. So we'll spend this week thinking about how we think about disasters and particularly how they influence our technologies. One of the points I'll be making, for instance, is that we often talk about natural disasters, but in some ways there are no such things as natural disasters. When, for instance, floods flood our homes, often it's because we are in flood zones, that we have made a particular technological and social choices to build our housing stock in low-lying areas that might be flooded. The same goes for how hurricanes create more and more damage, in part because we've made choices to develop large cities and dwelling spaces along dangerous stretches of the country, like the beaches in Florida. So it will turn out that what we call natural disasters actually arise largely from choices that we've made as a society. And then in the second lecture, I will look at the history of terrorism and how that plays out when it comes to technology. And here I'll be relying on a book by Mike Davis to lay out a brief history of the car bomb. So we can think about a particular form of terrorism and its relationship to technology. From there, we're going to describe what has been going on in the area of cultural history, which is a kind of new movement in the last 30 or 40 years in professional history. And we'll look at how historians of technology have been using cultural history to explore issues around it. For instance, we'll look at the historian Patrick McRae's work on what he calls visioneers, or people who imagine what the future might be like with technology, including things like space colonies and nanotechnology. We'll also look at the historian Adelheid Voskel's work on automata, or kind of basic robots, in the late 18th century, so in the 1700s, and what they meant to people at that time. From there, we will go into a week where we'll think about the relationship between our perceptions and our thoughts and technology. So we'll think about how technologies kind of enhance our perceptions, like with microscopes and telescopes. We'll think about how timekeeping technologies shape our perception of time. And we'll also be looking at, for instance, how people in Japan adopted Western timepieces and what that says about, or can show us about how different cultures think about time and the role that timepieces play in that. And then in the second part of the week, so the second lecture, we'll be talking about basically how, as human beings, we are cognitively limited. There's only so much thinking we can do. There's only so much processing we can do at any one moment. And how we use tools, starting with basic things like counters, abacuses, the kinds of sheets and that accountants use, all the way up through computing and how we use these things to aid our thinking. So, some people argue that an important thing that early computers were doing was helping engineers run differential equations, and that it just had become like to run differential equations regularly, which you needed to run things like the electric power grid. It was just too much, and so we had hit a kind of cognitive barrier. This is one argument that's out there. It might be true or false, but then what computers allow us to do is to go beyond that cognitive barrier. And we'll look at ideas around computing and other things that say, like, actually tools and technologies are a part of ourselves, that they are an extension, for instance, of our minds. There's a theory called the extended mind, so we'll think about that. Finally, in the final week, we'll look at how we can study the relationship between media and human thinking and action. So in the first lecture, I'll mostly spend time thinking about how the media industry actually functions, media industries, I should say. How they work as industries, and here we'll be paying special attention to how advertising has worked historically. So how advertisers and advertising experts developed target marketing in the late 70s and early 80s, and then we'll follow that story forward to think about how the kind of very fine micro-target marketing that goes on with the internet. So as many of you know, if you hang out on Amazon or eBay or whatever and looking at things, then you go to Facebook or other places, you'll see ads from Amazon and eBay showing you what you were just looking at and saying that you could get a deal. So we'll think about how advertising has developed. That's the first lecture. In the second lecture, we're going to think about how media influences thinking. We're going to find that this is really difficult to study. It's simply very, very hard to get at the issue of influence. But we'll look at the whole history of such studies going back to radio in the 1930s and think about, how humans relate to media, what they take away from it. One thing we'll find, for instance, is that people tend to choose media and news that already supports and kind of backs up their pre-existing worldviews, right? So depending on what your politics are, you're more likely to go to this website or that website because you don't really want to be challenged. You just want to have your pre-existing views kind of supported by the outside world. So we'll be thinking about these kinds of problems. How do we relate to media and what do we take away from it? Okay, so that's the weeks in the course. That's what we will be covering. Now, I briefly want to talk to you about how grading will work and such. How will we determine your final grade in this class? And there's basically four parts here. So, like all the courses that I teach, the class participation is a large part of your grade, 20%. And that's because I think participation is extremely important, that the only way you learn in a course is by interacting with the material in the course, and part of the way you do that is by asking questions, putting forward your own ideas, etc. Now, class participation will especially be important for the Friday sections when we talk about the readings, But I also want to encourage you to interrupt me, to raise your hand, what have you, while I'm lecturing to clarify points. So there's no reason that, we can't break down into a discussion in the middle of my lecture. That's totally fine, and you should be encouraged to interrupt me. The second thing is, as I've told you via email, there will be this kind of short essay on the topic, what is technology? That's worth 10%. And that's due next Wednesday. So the first time you actually meet me, you will hand me this essay. There's a couple reasons why I'm giving you this essay. The first is that it acts as a stand-in for us not meeting on Friday. The second is that it will get you kind of engaged in the issues of thinking about this topic, what is technology. And the third reason is that it's going to give me some sense of your writing style and where you are at with writing. There will be a midterm and a final in this class, and each will be worth 20%. And finally, there will be a final essay, which is worth 30%. In reality, that is going to break down into a couple different parts, one of which will be the actual final essay, but there will also be an outline due, an annotated bibliography due, and a proposal due, and those will eat up some percentage of the final essay percentage. Okay? Okay. Now, I often get the question, what does participation mean? Now, I've gotten this question more at Stevens than I have at any other place I've taught. Maybe it's a product of the culture here. Maybe not. Maybe it's just that people want real specificity about what they're supposed to be doing. So to help students understand what good participation looks like, I have created something called the zombie scale of classroom participation, which you will find on the syllabus. Now the zombie scale runs from 4 points to 0 points. To get 4 points or full credit for participation, this is what you should do. Congratulations! You are a healthy adult human being, and as a responsible adult, you have prepared and are now making quality in-class contributions. 3 points. You may have prepared, but your contributions are just okay and don't demonstrate any deep understanding of the material. Perhaps you were just having an off day, or, exclamation point, perhaps you have been bitten and now have the zombie plague. It's hard to say. 2 points. It's fairly clear you've been bitten now. You have the creeping zombie crud. Most times you sit silently, becoming gray and developing the zombie shake. Sometimes you may talk in class, but what you have to say is off topic, displays no sense that you've read the material, or is pure bullshit. And again, here I'm using the technical definition of that term. Every now and then you emit strange small sounds somewhere between a wheeze and a snore. Oftentimes when I'm walking around giving lectures, I will hear this strange sound come from students. It sounds kind of like something like that. That's bad. I want you to be engaged and with it, and not sleeping, for instance. 1 point. No signs of human life remain. Your body may be here, but your mind is not. If any thought is present, it is for checking your cell phones, which I don't want to see out in class. Also, I should state, it's in the syllabus, but I should reaffirm here, I don't allow computers or other screens in the course. You are free to bring notes. I encourage you to bring reading notes. And if you feel like you really need to have a hard copy of the thing we're discussing, which is probably a good idea, you should print it off. Now finally, 0 points, an unexcused absence. Becomes so zombified that you're not even here. In all likelihood, you are feasting on somebody's liver in Pierce Dining Hall. Okay, so that's the zombie scale of participation. Now, I don't know if there's much more to say at this point. I hope that this introductory lecture has given you some sense of where we're headed. For next week, you're going to read the 2 essays by Schatzberg and Nightingale, and you're going to write me that 3-page paper. You should also start thinking about when you are going to read the various essays for the second week, which will be due, you'll have to have done for discussion on next Friday. I will also say that of all the courses I've come up with, I've had this one in my head for about 2 years. This course is not just something that I thought would be good for you to learn, but it actually arises from a personal passion. I hope eventually that this course leads to a book called Peoples and Things. And so for that reason, I'm really, really excited. I'm really excited to be teaching you this course and to go through this experience with you, which of course means it'll probably go right off the tracks into a gutter somewhere, but we will try to make sure that that doesn't happen. I really look forward to meeting you all next week and seeing your faces. Okay, thank you very much.